The tray hit the floor before I even saw it coming. Milk splashed across the tiles, bits of food scattered everywhere, and the whole cafeteria went quiet for 1 second before the laughing started. I stood there with my hand still frozen in the air where the tray used to be, and I made a choice right then that would follow me through the rest of that year. I smiled. I bent down, picked up the mess, and said it was fine. It was not fine. Nothing about that moment was fine. But smiling was easier than explaining what would happen if I stopped smiling. My name is Kessa, and I am the only human being enrolled at the Thrennic Academy of Interstellar Youth. If you asked anyone in this school where I came from, they would tell you a single word, spoken like a warning: Earth. To them, my home planet is not a place people grow up. It is a place people barely survive. They call it a Deathworld, and they say the word the same way you might describe a haunted house, half curious and half afraid to get too close. I did not choose to be the only one of my kind here. My parents pushed for the scholarship for 2 years, filled out forms in 6 different alien languages, and cried actual tears when the acceptance letter arrived glowing on our kitchen table. They saw an opportunity. I saw, on my very first day, a room full of students who flinched every time I moved a little too fast. The boy who dropped my tray was named Doran, a lanky Thrennic student with pale blue skin and long fingers that never seemed to stop twitching. He did not do it out of hate. He did it because his friends were watching, and because knocking things out of my hands had become something of a game among a certain group in this school. A game with no real name, but everyone understood the rules. Bump into the human, watch her reaction, report back to the others. I understood the rules too. I just refused to play them the way they wanted. See, where I come from, a knocked-over lunch tray is not an insult. It is not even a minor inconvenience worth a second thought. On Earth, a bad day might involve a storm strong enough to lift a house off its foundation, or wildlife that considers a hiking trail to be its personal dinner table. Humans do not grow up soft. We grow up watching the ground for things that bite, and the sky for things that fall. By the time a human turns 18, we have usually survived several situations that would end most other species permanently. So when a Thrennic teenager knocks a tray out of my hand because it is funny to see the alien flinch, I do not flinch. I cannot flinch. My body forgot how to be startled by something so small a long time ago. Unfortunately for me, that calm reaction only made things worse. At first, I thought if I acted small, if I acted harmless, everyone would eventually get bored and leave me alone. That was the whole plan. Shrink myself down, speak softer than I needed to, walk slower than felt natural, laugh along with jokes about how strange and primitive my planet must be. I told myself this was survival too, just a different kind. Not the kind that involves outrunning something with too many teeth, but the kind that involves outlasting people who have never once been tested by anything real. The problem with hiding what you are is that it never actually stops the people looking for a reaction. It only teaches them where to push next. Vren was the one who decided pushing me was worth her time. She sat 2 tables over during lunch, always surrounded by a small crowd of students who laughed whenever she wanted them to, and went quiet whenever she wanted that instead. Vren came from one of the noble Thrennic bloodlines, the kind of family whose names appeared on buildings and starships and academic wings of universities across half the sector. She had never once, in her entire life, needed to worry about anything trying to end her existence. Her homeworld had been terraformed into something closer to a garden than a planet. No predators, no unpredictable weather, no history of anything going wrong in a way that could not be fixed by someone else. To Vren, danger was a story other species told to sound interesting. She found me the day after the tray incident, leaning against the wall outside my next class with her arms crossed, and that particular look on her face that I had already learned to recognize. It was the look of someone deciding whether or not I was worth the effort of being cruel to. "You didn't even react," she said, like an accusation. "React to what?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Doran dropped your tray right in front of everyone. Most students would have said something. You just picked it up and smiled like nothing happened." She tilted her head, studying me the way you might study an animal at a zoo enclosure, trying to decide if it was actually dangerous or just big. "Is that a human thing? Pretending you don't feel anything?" "Maybe I just don't get upset over spilled milk," I said. A few of her friends laughed at that, though I was not entirely sure if they were laughing with me, or preparing to laugh at whatever came next from Vren. "That's cute," she said, very controlled, very civilized. She said the word civilized like it tasted strange in her mouth. "Funny, considering where you're from. I heard humans used to hunt each other for food before you figured out farming. I heard your planet still has creatures large enough to eat a grown adult in a single bite. Sounds like a nice place to visit." I could have told her the truth. I could have told her that yes, actually, some of that was accurate, and that the reason I did not react to a dropped tray was because my nervous system had been calibrated by things far worse than embarrassment. I could have told her that flinching was a luxury my ancestors slowly trained out of our species, one dangerous encounter at a time, because the ones who flinched too long did not usually get the chance to pass that trait on. Instead, I just shrugged. It has its charms. Vren did not like that answer. I could tell by the way her jaw tightened, just slightly, the same way a predator's does right before it decides you are not worth chasing after all. Except in her case, it was the opposite. My calm was not making her lose interest. It was making her more determined to find the reaction she was looking for. "We'll see," she said, and walked off with her friends trailing behind her like a small parade. I stood there in the hallway, a moment longer than I needed to, replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out exactly what I had done wrong. Then I realized the answer. I had not done anything wrong. I had simply existed in a way that did not match the story everyone here had already decided to believe about my species. Weak, primitive, something to be studied and mocked from a safe distance. The truth was far less convenient for people like Vren, so nobody bothered looking for it. Classes that day passed the way they always did. I sat near the back, took notes on subjects most of my classmates had learned years earlier thanks to their advanced educational programs, and did my best not to draw attention to the fact that I was constantly playing catch-up in some areas, while somehow being years ahead in others. Human education did not follow the same neat timeline as Thrennic schooling. We learned differently, out of necessity. Survival skills came first. Everything else came after, squeezed into whatever time was left. By the time the final bell rang, I felt something settle in my chest that I did not have a name for yet. Not fear, exactly. Fear was something else entirely, something I understood on a much deeper level than most people in that building ever would. This felt more like pressure, the quiet, building kind that comes right before something finally breaks. I walked home that evening, along the same path I always took, past the tall silver buildings of the academic district, past students from a dozen different worlds heading in every direction, none of them paying me any attention at all. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it might feel like to simply belong here, not to be watched, not to be tested, just another student walking home after a long day. It was a nice thought. It did not last very long. Somewhere behind me, I heard footsteps that were walking just a little too close, just a little too deliberately, for it to be an accident. I did not turn around right away. I kept my pace steady, my breathing even, and I let my senses do what they were built to do. I counted the footsteps. 3 sets, maybe 4. I noticed the way the conversation behind me had dropped to a low murmur, the kind of quiet people use when they do not want their target to hear exactly what they are planning. On Earth, this would have been the moment my body prepared itself without asking my permission. Heart rate steady, not racing. Muscles ready, not tense. That was the difference between a human raised on a Deathworld and almost anyone else in this galaxy. We did not panic when trouble found us. Panic gets you killed. What we did instead was calculate. I turned a corner, and the footsteps followed. I stopped walking. The footsteps stopped too, just a few seconds too late to seem natural. I turned around slowly, and there was Vren, standing with 3 of her friends in the fading afternoon light, all of them wearing expressions that ranged from amused to slightly nervous, as if even they were not entirely sure what they were doing here yet. "Funny running into you," Vren said, though there was nothing funny about the tone of her voice. "You followed me for 6 blocks, I said. That's not exactly running into someone." One of her friends, a smaller Thrennic boy with nervous eyes, laughed a little too loudly at that, then went quiet when Vren shot him a look. "I just wanted to talk," Vren said, stepping closer. "Somewhere without an audience. See, in there, you play this little game where you pretend nothing bothers you. I want to know what happens when nobody else is watching. I felt the pressure in my chest shift into something sharper. "There's nothing to see," I said. "I'm just a student trying to get through the day like everyone else." "No," Vren said, shaking her head slowly. "You're not like everyone else. That's the whole point. You're supposed to be dangerous, wild, feral even. That's what they say about your planet. So why do you stand there smiling every time someone pushes you? Are you scared? Is that it? Are you actually scared of us?" I looked at her for a long moment, and something inside me, something I had been holding down carefully since the day I arrived at this school, shifted just slightly out of place. "No," I said quietly. "I'm not scared of you." Vren smiled, like she had finally gotten the reaction she wanted, even if it was not quite the one she expected. "Then prove it," she said, and took one more step forward, close enough now that I could see the exact moment her expression changed from confident to something else entirely. Because for the first time since I had arrived at this school, I did not step back. I did not smile. I simply stood there, steady and calm, in a way that made every single person in that alley go quiet, as if some old and distant instinct buried deep inside each of them had just quietly woken up and started paying attention. Vren did not know it yet, but she had just asked a Deathworld girl to stop pretending. And things, from that moment forward, were only going to get more interesting. Nothing happened in that alley that night. Not really. Vren stared at me for a long moment, her friends shifting nervously behind her, and then she laughed. A short, sharp sound that did not quite land the way she wanted it to. "Wow," she said. "Look at you, standing tall. That's adorable." She turned and walked away, her friends trailing behind her, and I stood there alone in the alley for a long time after they left, breathing slowly, feeling my own pulse settle back down to normal. Nothing had happened. No one had been hurt. But something had shifted, and I could feel it. The same way you can feel the air change right before a storm rolls in over open water. I did not sleep well that night. The next morning, the whispers had already started before I even reached my locker. I caught pieces of conversation as I walked down the hallway. Fragments meant to be quiet, but spoken just loud enough for me to hear anyway. Someone said I had threatened Vren. Someone else said I had cornered her in an alley after school, that I had gotten right up in her face, and said something about how humans handle problems back on our planet. None of it was true, but truth had very little to do with how quickly a story could spread through a school full of teenagers who had never once needed to question what they were told. By lunch, half the cafeteria was watching me out of the corners of their eyes. I sat alone, the way I usually did, and picked at a tray of food I had barely touched. A Varithi girl named Priya, one of the few students who had ever spoken to me without an audience of friends waiting to judge her for it, slid into the seat across from me, with a nervous kind of energy radiating off her. "People are saying you threatened Vren," she said, keeping her voice low. "I didn't threaten anyone," I said. "She followed me home. I told her I wasn't scared of her. That's the whole story." Priya studied me for a moment, her large dark eyes narrowing slightly, not with suspicion, but with genuine curiosity. "Is it true, about your planet, that you're not scared of things that would scare the rest of us?" I thought about how to answer that honestly, without sounding like I was bragging, or worse, like I was making excuses for something that had not even happened yet. "It's not that I'm not scared of anything," I said carefully. "It's that the scale is different. What scares people here might not even register as dangerous where I come from, and what's actually dangerous on my planet would probably terrify most people in this school before they even understood what they were looking at." Priya considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly, like she was filing the information away for later. "Vren doesn't like being embarrassed," she said, "especially not in front of her friends. You should be careful." I appreciated the warning, even if I already knew it was true. Over the next 2 weeks, the small, careless bullying I had grown used to turned into something more organized, more deliberate. My assignments started disappearing from shared class folders. A group project I had spent an entire weekend working on vanished the night before it was due, and when I asked my teacher for an extension, I was met with a polite but distant refusal, the kind of response that made it clear the staff at this school had already decided my complaints were not worth their full attention. "These things happen," my instructor told me, not quite meeting my eyes. "Try to be more careful with your files next time." I wanted to explain that carefulness had nothing to do with it, that someone had deliberately removed my work from a system that only a handful of students had access to, but I could already see how that conversation would go. I would sound paranoid, defensive, exactly the kind of dramatic, unstable behavior that people already expected from someone raised on a planet as unpredictable as mine. So I let it go, and I redid the project from scratch, staying up long into the night, while the rest of the dormitory slept peacefully around me. The rumors kept growing too, feeding on themselves the way rumors do when nobody bothers to check if they are true. I heard that I had once broken another student's arm on a dare back on Earth. I heard that I kept some kind of dangerous creature in my dorm room as a pet, smuggled in from home. I heard, more than once, that my species could not truly be trusted, that we were only pretending to be civilized, long enough to be allowed into schools like this one, and that eventually, our true nature would show itself. None of it was true. All of it hurt in a way I had not expected. Because here is the strange thing about growing up on a planet everyone considers dangerous. You spend your whole life being told that the real threats are outside, in the wilderness, in the weather, in the long list of creatures and disasters that could end your life on any given day. Nobody prepares you for the quieter threat of an entire community deciding, without evidence, that you are something to be feared and mocked in equal measure. I found myself, more than once, standing in front of the mirror in my dorm room late at night, studying my own reflection, like I was trying to find whatever it was that made everyone around me so uneasy. I did not look dangerous. I looked tired. I looked like a teenager very far from home, trying her best to make it through another ordinary day, in a place that refused to see her as ordinary. Vren, for her part, seemed to grow more frustrated as the weeks went on, not less. I think she expected her games to break me eventually, to finally get the reaction she had been chasing since that first conversation outside my classroom. Instead, I kept showing up, kept turning in my work, even when it had to be redone from scratch, kept walking through the hallways with my head held level, refusing to give her the satisfaction of watching me shrink. The breaking point, when it finally came, happened in the middle of the school's central courtyard, in full view of nearly 100 students during the afternoon break. I was walking toward the library, my arms full of books I needed for an assignment, when Vren stepped directly into my path, her friends spreading out behind her in a loose half-circle, the way predators do when they want to make sure their target has nowhere easy to run. "You've been awfully quiet lately," she said. "I was starting to think maybe you'd learned your lesson." "What lesson would that be?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "That this isn't your planet," Vren said, her voice rising just enough for the surrounding students to hear clearly. "You don't get to act tough here. You don't get to stand there pretending you're not scared, like some kind of wild animal that wandered into civilization by mistake." A small crowd had started to gather, the way crowds always do when tension builds in a public space. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, waiting to see what would happen next, and for a moment, I genuinely considered simply walking around her, letting the moment pass the way I had let so many moments pass before. But something in me, something that had been quietly building over the past 2 weeks of missing assignments and cruel rumors and teachers who looked the other way, refused to let this one go. "I'm not pretending anything," I said, my voice steady and clear enough for the crowd around us to hear. "I've been polite this entire time because I was trying to make things easier for everyone, including myself. That was a choice, not a limitation." Vren's expression flickered, just slightly, like she had not expected me to speak up at all, let alone with that much confidence. "A choice," she repeated, almost mockingly. "Sure, let's test that." She reached out and shoved me, hard, both hands connecting squarely with my shoulders, clearly expecting the force to send me stumbling backward into the small crowd that had gathered behind me. I did not move. Not an inch, not a stumble, not even a slight shift of my weight to absorb the impact. I simply stood there, exactly where I had been standing before her hands ever touched me, my books still balanced perfectly in my arms, my expression unreadable. The courtyard went completely silent. Vren stared at her own hands for a moment, as if trying to understand why they had not produced the result she expected. Then she looked up at me, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something flicker behind her eyes that was not amusement or superiority. It was uncertainty. "That's not possible," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "On my planet," I said, keeping my voice calm and even, "we call that a light push." A few students near the edge of the crowd exchanged glances, and I could hear the murmur beginning to spread, the same way rumors always did in this school. Except this time, the story being told was true. Vren's friends shifted uncomfortably behind her, and I noticed the small Thrennic boy who had laughed nervously in the alley 2 weeks earlier taking a small, deliberate step backward, putting a little more distance between himself and whatever was about to happen next. "You think that's impressive," Vren said, her voice rising, trying to reclaim whatever ground she had just lost in front of her audience. "Standing there like a statue? That's just you being stubborn. It doesn't prove anything." "You're right," I said. "It doesn't prove anything. Not yet." I do not know exactly what made me say that. Maybe it was 2 weeks of missing assignments and cruel rumors finally catching up with my patience. Maybe it was simply the accumulated weight of trying to be smaller than I actually was for the sake of everyone else's comfort. Whatever the reason, something had shifted in that courtyard, and both Vren and I could feel it, even if neither of us fully understood yet what it meant. The bell rang, cutting through the tense silence, and the crowd slowly began to disperse, whispering among themselves as they headed toward their next classes. Vren stood there a moment longer, staring at me with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between anger and something closer to fear. "This isn't over," she said finally. "I know," I said quietly, and for once, I was not simply trying to reassure myself. Because deep down, in the part of me that had spent years learning to read danger the way other people read weather forecasts, I already understood that Vren was not the kind of person who backed down after a public embarrassment. If anything, that courtyard moment had only made things more dangerous, not less. She would need to prove something now, not just to me, but to everyone who had witnessed her fail to move me with her own 2 hands. I walked to my next class with my books held tightly against my chest, my heart rate finally beginning to climb for the first time in weeks, not from fear, but from the quiet, familiar recognition that whatever came next was going to be far more serious than spilled milk or missing assignments. Somewhere out there, Vren was already planning her next move, and I had a feeling I was not going to like it. To understand what happened next, you would need to understand exactly what it means to grow up on a planet most of the galaxy has agreed to call unsafe for civilized life. I was not born knowing how to stand still while someone pushed me with all their strength and feel nothing at all. Nobody is born with that kind of steadiness. It gets built, slowly, over years of small lessons that most people in this school would never have to learn in 100 lifetimes. My grandmother used to tell me stories about her own childhood, growing up in a coastal town where the ocean itself was considered one of the milder dangers on the list. She talked about storms that could tear a roof from a house in minutes, about learning from a very young age which plants were safe to touch, and which ones could put you in a hospital bed for a week. She talked about the drills schools ran, not for fires or simple emergencies, but for situations involving wildlife that had wandered too close to populated areas, animals large enough and fast enough that a single moment of panic could be the difference between walking away and not walking away at all. By the time I was old enough to attend school myself, those drills had changed shape, but the underlying lesson remained the same. Panic gets you killed. Calm keeps you alive. It was taught to us the way other schools might teach basic arithmetic, repeated so many times that it eventually stopped feeling like a lesson and simply became a part of how we existed in the world. I remember being maybe 7 years old, walking home from a friend's house with my older cousin, when a sudden storm rolled in faster than anyone expected. The sky turned a strange greenish color, the air went thick and heavy, and within minutes, we were sheltering beneath an overpass, while wind strong enough to lift small vehicles roared past us on either side. I did not cry. I did not scream. My cousin held my hand and counted slowly, the same way our parents had taught us, and we waited it out together, calm and quiet, until the worst of it passed. That was an ordinary Tuesday where I come from. By the time I turned 12, I had already lived through 2 hurricanes, one close encounter with a predator large enough to end my life in a single moment of bad luck, and countless smaller incidents that most people in this school would consider the worst day of their entire lives. None of these experiences made me fearless. Fear is useful. Fear keeps you paying attention to the things that matter. What those experiences did was teach me the difference between genuine danger and everything else, a distinction that most people at this academy had simply never needed to make. A shove in a crowded courtyard did not even register on the same scale as the things I had already survived. It was not that I was ignoring the pain or pretending not to feel it. There simply was not enough force behind it to register as a threat worth reacting to. Vren, understandably, had no way of knowing any of this. To her, my calm reaction looked like a performance, a stubborn refusal to admit weakness in front of a crowd. She could not see the years of storms and close calls standing behind that stillness, because nothing in her own life had ever required that kind of resilience. Her homeworld had been carefully shaped by generations of engineers and terraformers into something closer to a garden than a planet. Every dangerous variable slowly removed until almost nothing remained that could genuinely threaten a person's life without extraordinary bad luck. I did not blame her for not understanding. I simply wished, more than once during those difficult weeks, that she would at least try. Instead, she doubled down. 3 days after the Courtyard incident, our combined science and survival class was scheduled for something called an integrated response simulation, a program the Academy used to test how students reacted under carefully controlled pressure. The simulation took place inside a large chamber lined with holographic projectors, capable of generating incredibly realistic environments and scenarios, all monitored closely by faculty to ensure student safety at every stage. The purpose of these simulations, as our instructor explained at the start of the class, was to help students understand their own instinctive reactions to sudden stress, whether that meant a simulated engineering failure aboard a starship, a diplomatic negotiation gone wrong, or an unexpected environmental hazard during a planetary survey mission. Students were paired up and assigned scenarios individually, monitored by sensors that tracked heart rate, reaction time, and decision-making under pressure. I did not think much of it when I saw my name paired with a scenario labeled only by a numerical code. Simulations were routine at this school, run every few weeks as part of our standard curriculum. I had completed a dozen of them already without incident, calmly working through simulated equipment failures and minor emergencies, while my classmates around me sometimes struggled to keep their composure. What I did not know, until it was already too late to change anything, was that someone had accessed the simulation system the night before and altered my assigned scenario. I found out the moment the chamber door sealed behind me, and the holographic environment flickered to life around me, replacing the empty white room with something far more specific and far more personal than any standard training scenario should have been. The simulation placed me inside a recreation of a dense forest environment, dim light filtering down through tall trees, the air thick with humidity and the distant sound of running water somewhere off to my right. For a brief moment, I simply stood there, taking in the details, noting how unusually specific and realistic this particular environment felt compared to the more generic scenarios I had experienced before. Then I heard the growl. It was low and deep, coming from somewhere behind a cluster of dense undergrowth roughly 20 meters ahead of me, and even though every rational part of my mind understood this was a simulation, a carefully controlled program running inside a secure chamber monitored by faculty, something older and more instinctive inside me recognized that sound immediately and reacted before my conscious thoughts had even finished processing what I was hearing. Whoever had designed this particular scenario had clearly done their research on Earth's more dangerous wildlife, because the creature that emerged from the undergrowth a moment later was an almost perfect recreation of one of the most feared predators from my home continent, easily large enough to represent genuine mortal danger to any unprepared person standing in its path. I want to be clear about something here. I did not panic. I did not freeze. What happened instead was faster and quieter than either of those responses, something closer to a switch flipping deep inside my nervous system, honed by years of drills and lessons and lived experience, into a single, coordinated sequence of actions that took less than 2 seconds from start to finish. I identified the nearest defensible position, a cluster of large rocks off to my left that would limit the angles from which the creature could approach me. I calculated the distance between myself and the simulated threat, noting its speed and trajectory as it moved toward me through the undergrowth. I located, almost without conscious thought, a fallen branch nearby that could serve as a makeshift tool if the situation escalated further, and I positioned myself accordingly, my breathing steady, my body low and controlled, every movement precise and economical. None of this involved panic. None of this involved fear in the way most people imagine fear, the kind that freezes you in place or sends you running blindly in whatever direction feels safest. What I felt instead was a kind of intense, focused clarity, my mind working through the scenario with the same calm efficiency my grandmother had described feeling during that childhood storm decades earlier. The simulated creature charged, and I moved. I will not go into every detail of what happened over the next several seconds, because the truth is that most of it happened faster than conscious thought, guided by instincts built over years of training and lived experience, rather than any deliberate strategy I could have explained afterward. What I can say is that by the time the simulation chamber's safety protocols recognized the scenario had reached its natural conclusion and shut the program down, I was standing exactly where I had started, breathing steady, completely unharmed, having successfully avoided every point of contact the simulated predator had attempted. The chamber door slid open, and I stepped out into the observation room, where I found nearly the entire class standing in stunned silence, staring at a large display screen that had apparently been showing my entire simulation to everyone watching from outside. Our instructor, a normally composed Verithi woman named Elowin, stood frozen in front of the console, her hand still hovering over the emergency shutdown controls she had clearly been prepared to use if the situation had escalated beyond what she considered safe parameters. "That scenario," she said slowly, her voice carrying an edge of something I had never heard from her before, "was not one I assigned." The room went very quiet. I looked around at my classmates, most of whom were staring at me with expressions I could not quite read, somewhere between shock and something closer to genuine unease. Vren stood near the back of the group, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression carefully neutral in a way that told me everything I needed to know. "Someone accessed the simulation database last night and modified my assigned scenario," I said, keeping my voice level, though my pulse was still elevated from the simulation itself. "I'd like to know who." Elowin's fingers moved quickly across the console, pulling up access logs and system records, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "This is a significant breach," she said, mostly to herself. "Modifying a live training scenario without authorization violates at least 4 different safety protocols." "It was supposed to be funny," a voice said from near the back of the room, quiet and uncertain. Every head turned toward the small Thrennic boy, who had been part of Vren's group since the very beginning, the one who had laughed nervously in the alley all those weeks ago. He looked pale, his eyes wide, clearly regretting the words the moment they left his mouth. "Funny," Elowin repeated, her voice flat and dangerous, in a way that made even Vren shift uncomfortably. "You thought placing a live predator scenario, taken directly from a documented Deathworld environment, into a training simulation for a fellow student was funny. We didn't think it would actually hurt her," the boy said, his voice cracking slightly. "We just wanted to see her react. Everyone kept saying she wasn't scared of anything, and we wanted to prove that wasn't true. We thought she'd panic, or scream, or something. We didn't think." He stopped himself, realizing too late exactly how much he had already revealed. Elowin turned slowly to look at the rest of the group standing near the back of the room, her gaze finally settling on Vren, with an intensity that made the confident, composed girl I had first met weeks earlier suddenly look very young and very unsure of herself. "Vren," Elowin said quietly, "did you have anything to do with this?" For the first time since I had known her, Vren hesitated. "It was a joke," she said finally, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "We wanted to see what would actually happen. Everyone talks about Deathworlds like they're the most dangerous places in the galaxy, and she just stands there, acting like nothing bothers her. We wanted proof, one way or another." "Proof," Elowin repeated slowly, glancing back at the display screen, which still showed a frozen image from the final moment of the simulation. My own figure standing calm and steady, in the exact position I had started, completely unaffected by an encounter that had been specifically designed to overwhelm and frighten me. "I believe you got your proof." The room fell silent again, and I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes shifting from Vren to me and back again. The story of what had just happened, already beginning to take shape in everyone's mind, spreading through the room, the same way rumors always did in this school, except this time, there would be no need for exaggeration or embellishment. The recording spoke for itself. Elowen turned to me, her expression softening slightly, though the tension in her shoulders remained. Kessa, she said, are you all right? I thought about that question for a long moment before answering, considering everything that had led up to this exact point. Weeks of small humiliations I had chosen to let slide, missing assignments and cruel rumors I had quietly worked around rather than confronting directly, a public shove in a crowded courtyard that I had absorbed without complaint, hoping it would be enough to satisfy whatever need Vren had to prove some kind of point. None of it had been enough. If anything, my patience had only encouraged this exact outcome, a scenario designed specifically to frighten me, built by classmates who had decided my calm was something to be broken rather than respected. I'm fine, I said finally, but I don't think I should have had to be. Elowen nodded slowly, understanding something in my tone that went far deeper than the immediate incident. No, she agreed quietly. You shouldn't have. She turned back to the console, her fingers moving quickly as she began pulling up additional records, her expression growing more serious with each new piece of information that appeared on the screen. This isn't just a simulation breach, she said, mostly to herself. There are access logs here going back weeks, missing assignment files, altered class schedules. This has been happening for far longer than today. I watched as the full scope of what had been happening to me over the past several weeks began to surface, laid out in cold, undeniable data on a screen in front of an entire class, no longer something that could be dismissed as misunderstanding or bad luck or simple carelessness with digital files. Vren stood very still, watching the same information appear, her earlier confidence completely gone now, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably close to real fear. This is going to require a formal review, Elowen said, addressing the entire class now, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly how serious this situation had become. All of you, back to your seats. I need to contact the administration immediately. As the class slowly filed back to their seats, whispering quietly among themselves, I remained standing near the simulation chamber door, watching Vren out of the corner of my eye. She was staring at the display screen, at the frozen image of me standing calm and unharmed, in the middle of a scenario designed specifically to break me. And for the first time since I had met her, I saw something in her expression that was not superiority or amusement, or even simple curiosity. It was the dawning realization that she had badly, dangerously misjudged exactly what she was dealing with. And somewhere deep inside me, past the exhaustion and the lingering adrenaline from the simulation itself, I felt something shift permanently into place. I was done shrinking myself down to make other people comfortable. The formal review took place 2 days later, in a conference room on the top floor of the administration building, a space I had never once needed to visit during my entire time at the academy. The room was lined with tall windows overlooking the school's central courtyard, the very same courtyard where Vren had shoved me in front of nearly 100 witnesses just days earlier. I sat at one end of a long table, flanked by Elowen and the academy's headmaster, a tall, dignified Verithi man named Callum, whose reputation for fairness had apparently earned him the respect of students and faculty alike, even if I had never personally interacted with him before this moment. Across from us sat Vren, along with the 3 friends who had been present during the courtyard incident, each of them accompanied by a parent or guardian who had been called in for the meeting. Vren's mother, a severe-looking woman dressed in the formal attire typical of the noble Thrennic bloodlines, sat rigidly beside her daughter, her expression unreadable, but her posture tense enough to suggest she was not pleased with the circumstances that had brought her here. Let's begin, Callum said, his voice calm but firm, carrying the kind of authority that immediately settled the room into silence. I've reviewed the simulation records, the access logs, and the statements provided by both students and faculty. I'd like to hear directly from those involved before we discuss next steps. Over the following hour, the full story came out, piece by piece, laid bare in front of everyone in that room. The missing assignments, the altered class schedules, the rumors spread without any basis in fact. And finally the simulation itself, deliberately modified to place me inside a scenario designed to frighten and overwhelm me in front of an entire class. Vren sat through most of it with her eyes fixed on the table in front of her, offering only short, quiet answers when directly questioned. The confident, sharp-edged girl who had followed me home weeks earlier seemed to have shrunk somehow, diminished by the weight of evidence laid out clearly for everyone to see. I want to understand something, Callum said finally, addressing Vren directly. What exactly were you hoping to accomplish with all of this? Vren was quiet for a long moment before answering. I don't know, she said finally, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. Everyone kept talking about her like she was something dangerous, something wild. But she just stood there acting completely calm, no matter what happened. I thought if I pushed hard enough, I'd finally see what everyone said was underneath all of that. I wanted proof that the stories were true. And what did you find instead? Callum asked. Vren glanced at me for the first time since the meeting had started, her expression difficult to read. I found out I was wrong about almost everything, she said quietly. Not about her being dangerous, about what that actually means. I did not say anything for a long moment, considering her words carefully. There was something almost sad in the admission, a recognition that had come far too late and at far too high a cost, both to me and, in a different way, to her as well. Can I say something? I asked, and Callum nodded, gesturing for me to continue. I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. I spent the last several weeks trying to make myself smaller, I said, trying to laugh off things that hurt, trying to convince everyone, including myself, that none of it mattered, because I thought that was the only way to survive here without causing more trouble than I was worth. That was a mistake, and I understand now that it probably made this situation worse, not better. Vren looked up at that, clearly not expecting me to take any share of responsibility for what had happened. But that doesn't excuse what was done to me, I continued. The missing assignments, the rumors, and especially that simulation. Someone deliberately tried to frighten me, using a recreation of something genuinely dangerous from my home planet, without any understanding of what that actually meant, or what the consequences could have been if things had gone differently. They could have been serious consequences, Elowen added quietly, if Kessa's reactions had been even slightly different, if she had panicked rather than responding with the level of composure she demonstrated. That scenario could have caused genuine psychological harm. We are fortunate that did not happen. Callum nodded slowly, making notes on the tablet in front of him. This is a serious matter, he said, addressing the room. Unauthorized access to school systems, deliberate falsification of training scenarios, and a documented pattern of harassment extending over several weeks. These are not minor disciplinary issues. He turned to Vren and her friends. You will each face formal consequences, including suspension and a mandatory review of your conduct records before any consideration of continued enrollment at this academy. Additionally, given the severity of what occurred, I will be recommending mandatory education regarding interstellar cultural sensitivity, specifically regarding the treatment of students from environments significantly different from your own. Vren's mother finally spoke, her voice cold and controlled. This will not reflect well on our family name. With respect, Callum said, his tone remaining calm but firm. Your daughter's actions reflect on your family far more than anything I decide today. I would suggest focusing less on reputation and more on understanding exactly what led to this situation in the first place. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, working through the specific details of the disciplinary process, but I found my attention drifting toward Vren, watching the way she sat there, quiet and still, seemingly lost in thought. When the meeting finally ended and everyone began filing out of the room, I found myself walking down the hallway just a few steps behind her, close enough that when she suddenly stopped and turned around, I nearly walked directly into her. "Can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice quiet, none of the sharp edges from our earlier encounters present in her tone. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded, and we stepped off to the side of the hallway, away from the small crowd of parents and students still filtering out of the conference room. "I owe you an apology," Vren said, and I could tell from the way she said it that this was not something that came naturally to her. A real one, not the kind I was planning to give if the administration forced my hand. "Okay," I said, waiting to hear more. "I've never had to worry about anything," she continued, her eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder, as if it were easier to say this without looking directly at me. "My whole life, everything has been safe, comfortable. My family made sure of that, generations ago, when they helped fund the terraforming projects that turned our homeworld into what it is today. I've never once been in a situation where I genuinely thought I might not survive it. That's not something to apologize for," I said. "Being safe isn't a crime." "No," she agreed, But I think I resented you for having something I didn't, even if I would never have admitted that to myself before now. You walked into this school from a planet everyone talks about like it's some kind of nightmare, and instead of being broken by it, you just seemed so completely unshakable. I think part of me wanted to prove that couldn't possibly be real, because if it was real, it meant everything I'd been taught about my own strength and confidence was built on something a lot more fragile than yours. I considered her words carefully, surprised by the honesty behind them. For what it's worth, I said finally, I wasn't trying to make you feel small. I was just trying to survive a situation I didn't fully understand either. This school, all of you, this is just as unfamiliar to me as my planet probably sounds to you. Vren nodded slowly, something shifting behind her eyes that looked almost like genuine understanding. I think I need to learn a lot more about where you actually come from, she said. Not the stories everyone tells, the real version. I'd be willing to talk about it, I said, and I meant it, even after everything that had happened. If you're actually interested. I am, she said, and for the first time since I had met her, I believed she meant exactly what she said. We stood there in the quiet hallway for a moment longer, the tension between us finally beginning to ease into something that felt, if not quite like friendship, at least like the possibility of one. It was not a complete resolution. There were still consequences ahead for her, still trust that would need to be rebuilt slowly over time, if it could be rebuilt at all. But it was a start, and after everything that had happened over the past several weeks, a start was more than I had expected to find in that conference room today. As I walked back toward my dormitory that evening, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the courtyard where this entire conflict had first become impossible to ignore, I found myself thinking about my grandmother's stories again, about storms and calm, and the strange kind of strength that comes from simply refusing to panic when everything around you suggests you should. I had spent weeks trying to hide that strength, worried it would make me seem strange or frightening to people who had never needed anything like it themselves. But standing there in that hallway, watching Vren walk away with something that looked genuinely like reflection on her face, I realized that hiding it had never actually protected me from anything. It had only delayed the moment when everyone finally had to see me clearly. And now that they had, whatever came next, at least it would be built on something real. 3 weeks passed before things at the academy began to feel normal again, though normal now meant something different than it had before the simulation incident. Vren and her 3 friends served their suspensions, returning to classes quietly, and without the same crowd of admirers that had once followed Vren wherever she went. The small Thrennic boy who had first admitted to the modified simulation, a boy named Callan, approached me during my first week back to classes, offering a genuine apology that felt far more sincere than I had expected from someone who had once laughed nervously while watching his friends target me. I should have said something sooner, he told me, standing awkwardly near my locker one morning. I knew it was wrong, I just didn't want to be the one who spoke up. You did eventually, I said. That matters more than you might think. He nodded, relief clearly visible on his face, and from that point forward, he became one of the first students at the academy who genuinely seemed to want to understand more about where I came from, asking careful, thoughtful questions during lunch periods about Earth's history, its wildlife, and the strange, layered relationship humans had with a planet that had shaped us into something the rest of the galaxy still struggled to fully understand. Priya, the Verithi girl who had first warned me about Vren's temper weeks earlier, became a closer friend during those following weeks, often sitting with me during meals and asking questions of her own, though hers tended to focus less on danger and more on the everyday details of life back home. She wanted to know about human music, human food, the strange rituals and holidays that filled our calendar year, things that had nothing to do with survival or danger, and everything to do with simply being human, in a way that felt increasingly comfortable to share. Word of the incident had spread well beyond our own classroom, eventually reaching faculty and administrators across the entire academy, and even, I later learned, drawing attention from certain diplomatic offices involved in ongoing discussions about Earth's potential recognition within the wider interstellar community. Apparently, my planet's application for formal recognition had been under quiet review for several years, tangled in bureaucratic hesitation, largely rooted in exactly the kind of fear and misunderstanding I had been dealing with here at school, except on a much larger, much more consequential scale. I learned this from Elowin, who called me into her office one afternoon, roughly a month after the disciplinary hearing, holding a datapad with information she seemed unusually eager to share. "I wanted you to see this," she said, sliding the datapad across her desk toward me. "The simulation footage, along with the full report from your disciplinary hearing, was requested by the Interstellar Education Oversight Committee. They're using it as part of an ongoing review regarding Earth's application status." I stared at the screen, scrolling through pages of formal language and official reports, my own name appearing repeatedly throughout documents that clearly carried far more weight than I had ever imagined a school incident could hold. "They're saying the footage demonstrates something important," Elowin continued. "Not that humans are dangerous, but that the assumptions everyone has been making about your species have been built on incomplete and often exaggerated information. Your composure under a genuinely threatening simulated scenario, without any hint of the aggressive or unstable behavior your species has been unfairly associated with, is apparently being treated as significant evidence in ongoing diplomatic discussions." I sat back slowly, absorbing the weight of what she was telling me. All of this, the bullying, the missing assignments, the modified simulation that had been designed specifically to frighten me, had somehow become a small but meaningful piece of a much larger conversation about how an entire planet would be perceived and treated by the rest of the galaxy going forward. "I never wanted any of this to become something so big," I said quietly. "I understand that," Elowin said, her expression softening. "But sometimes, the things we don't choose end up mattering the most. What happened to you was wrong, and I'm genuinely sorry it took something this serious for the administration to properly address it. But the way you handled yourself throughout all of it, the composure, the restraint, even the honesty during that hearing, that spoke volumes to people far beyond the walls of this school." I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, turning it over in my mind during the quiet hours before sleep, trying to make sense of how something that had felt so isolating and difficult while it was happening had somehow transformed into something with implications reaching far beyond my own small, personal struggles. There was a strange kind of loneliness in being understood only through fear, I realized. For weeks, people at this school had watched me with a mixture of curiosity and unease, treating my calm as something almost inhuman, a trait to be tested and provoked rather than simply respected as part of who I was. Even now, with Vren's apology and Callan's genuine curiosity and Priya's easy friendship, I still occasionally caught glimpses of that same uneasy fascination in the eyes of students I had never spoken to before. Students who now knew my name specifically because of an incident that had, in its own strange way, defined me before I ever had the chance to define myself. But there was something hopeful in it too, if I looked closely enough. Callan's questions were not born from fear anymore, but from genuine curiosity, the kind that comes from someone who wants to understand rather than simply categorize. Priya's friendship felt real, built on shared conversations rather than assumptions about what my species was supposed to be like. And even Vren, despite everything that had happened between us, had begun spending her lunch periods at a small table near the edge of the cafeteria, reading through material about Earth's history and ecology that I had recommended to her during one of our increasingly regular conversations. "Did you know," she said to me one afternoon, several weeks after the disciplinary hearing, glancing up from a datapad filled with information about Earth's various climate zones, "that your planet actually has regions that are almost as calm and predictable as my own homeworld? I always assumed the entire planet was constant chaos." "Most people assume that," I said, settling into the seat across from her. "It's easier to imagine an entire planet as uniformly dangerous than to understand that it's actually a lot more complicated than that. Some regions really are as difficult as the stories suggest. Others are just as safe and comfortable as anywhere else in the galaxy." "That makes more sense," Vren said thoughtfully. "I think I built this whole idea of your planet, and by extension you, out of nothing but the most extreme stories I'd ever heard. I never stopped to think that maybe the full picture was more complicated than that." "Most people don't," I said, not unkindly. "It's a very human tendency too, honestly. We do the same thing with unfamiliar places and unfamiliar people. It's not unique to your species." Vren smiled slightly at that, the first genuine smile I had seen from her since this entire situation had begun. "I suppose that's a strangely comforting thought," she said, "that even Deathworld humans occasionally jump to the wrong conclusions about other people." "More often than you'd think," I admitted, and for a moment, sitting there in the quiet cafeteria, surrounded by the ordinary noise of students finishing their lunches and hurrying toward afternoon classes. It felt almost possible to believe that this strange, difficult chapter of my time at the academy might finally be settling into something calmer, something closer to genuine peace. That evening, walking back to my dormitory beneath a sky filled with unfamiliar stars, I found myself thinking about my parents, about the tears they had shed reading my acceptance letter all those months ago, about the hope they had carried for what this opportunity might mean, not just for me, but for how our entire species might eventually be understood by the rest of the galaxy. I thought about how far that hope had traveled since then, from a simple wish for their daughter to receive a good education, into something that had somehow become part of a much larger conversation about fear, misunderstanding, and the slow, difficult process of learning to see beyond the stories we tell ourselves about people and places we do not yet understand. I did not know, standing there beneath those unfamiliar stars, exactly how Earth's application for interstellar recognition would eventually be decided, or how long that process might still take. I did not know whether the footage from my simulation or the details of my disciplinary hearing would ultimately make a meaningful difference in that much larger, much more complicated diplomatic conversation. What I did know was that I was done shrinking myself down to make other people comfortable with who I was and where I came from. I was done pretending that surviving a Deathworld made me something to be feared rather than simply understood. And I was cautiously, carefully hopeful that the small, quiet changes happening around me, in Callan's genuine curiosity, in Priya's easy friendship, in Vren's slowly shifting understanding, might represent something larger too, a small crack in the wall of fear and misunderstanding that had surrounded my entire species for far longer than I had been alive. It was not a perfect resolution. There would still be difficult days ahead, still students who looked at me with unease, still faculty members who occasionally forgot to consider how their assumptions about my species shaped the way they treated me. Change, I was learning, rarely arrived all at once. It arrived slowly, in small conversations and quiet moments of genuine curiosity, one person at a time, one shifted assumption at a time. But for the first time since I had arrived at the Thrennic Academy of Interstellar Youth, walking alone and uncertain into a school full of students who had never once needed to learn the lessons that shaped my entire childhood, I felt something settle inside me that I had not expected to find here. I felt, quietly and carefully, like I finally belonged. Not because I had made myself smaller to fit into a space built for people very different from me, but because I had finally allowed myself to be exactly who I was, calm and steady, and shaped by a planet the rest of the galaxy still struggled to understand, and had discovered, against all my earlier expectations, that some people were genuinely willing to meet me there. Somewhere far above the academy, beyond the reach of the unfamiliar stars scattered across that alien sky, a small planet called Earth continued spinning quietly through its own dangerous, beautiful orbit, entirely unaware that a single difficult year at a school, light years away, had just become a small but meaningful part of the long, slow story of how the rest of the galaxy would finally come to understand exactly what it meant to come from a world that demanded everything from the people who called it home. And for the first time in a long time, I found myself genuinely looking forward to whatever came next.